Check 1 2. 1 2. 1 2. Check 1 2. 1 2 3. Check 1 2. 1 2 3. Check 1 2. 1 2 3 4. Check 1 2. 1 2. Check 1 2. 1 2 3. 1 2. 1 2. Check 1 2. 1 2 3 4. Check 1 2. 1 2. Check 1 2. 1 2 3 4. Check 1 2. 1 2 3 4. 1 2 3 4. 1 2. Check 1 2. Check 1 2.
Thank you.
1 2. Check 1 2. 1 2.
It's a pleasure. Good to meet you. Of course. Okay, it should be pretty straightforward.
Check. Check 1 2. Check. 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 Check 1 2. Check 1 2. 1 2 3. 1 2. 1 2 3. 1 2 3 4. Check. Check 1 2.
The short of it is Saturday, so I know.
It's not going well.
Check.
Do you know where?
Check 1 2. 1 2 3. Check. Check 1 2. 1 2. 1 2. Check. Check 1 2. 1 2 3. Check. Check 1 2. 1 2. 1 2 3 4. Check. Check 1 2 3 4. 1 2 3 4. 1 2 3 4.
Whoever lives inside.
1 2 3 4. 1 1 1 1 1.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know where to look anymore. I've looked in the green room. I've looked.
Check 1 2. 1 2 3. Check. Check 1 2. 1 2 3 4. Check. Check 1 2. 1 2 3 4. 1 2 3. 1 2. 1 2 3 4. 1 2.
Because the last time we used it was for the reading room event, when you set up that, right?
Yeah. Check 1 2 1 2. Check 1 2 1 2. Check 1 2 1 2.
It turns green.
Okay.
When you're good to go.
I can do that.
All right.
Press.
And it will
Okay.
turn green.
Okay.
You guys see me?
Landscape. I'm Michelle Flournoy. I'm the CEO of the Center for New American Security, and very pleased you could join us here today. We're also pleased to be able to co-host this event with the Center on Law and Security at NYU, and really want to thank NYU and Zach in particular for allowing us to use this venue. So the announcement of the Iran deal, as you all know, last week marked the end of a multi-year U.S.-led international effort aimed at preventing Iran's acquisition of nuclear weapons. This effort combined initial outreach sanctions, probably the most crippling sanctions ever put together in our history, coercive pressure, and ultimately very intensive diplomacy. After a year and a half of negotiations between the P5+1 and Iran, the parties announced a deal. And today we have an opportunity first to hear from John Wolfstall, an administration official, to better understand the deal in its details and some of the administration's thinking behind some of the provisions. And then in the panel discussions to consider more broadly the impacts of the deal on regional security and the economic landscape more broadly. As we speak right now, Secretary of Defense Ash Carter is actually in the region, first in Israel and then later visiting some of our partners in the Gulf, to talk about the deal and try to allay some of their concerns. One of the chief concerns that friends in the region have raised is the fact that once sanctions are lifted on Iran, Iran will have access to about $150 billion of assets. And many in the region and here worry that Iran might use at least some of that windfall to bolster parts, not only bolster parts of its ailing domestic economy, but also to fund destabilizing activities in the region. And so whether that's propping up the Assad regime in Syria, funding terrorist groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, or sending arms to the Houthi rebels in Yemen. So the question we want to consider today is what is our broader strategy to deal with these regional security concerns and reassure our partners as the deal goes forward. Similarly, as sanctions come off, the repercussions of Iran's reentry into the global economy, its ability to once again put oil onto the international market, that raises uncertainties and opportunities as well. And there are lots of questions about the so-called snapback mechanism and how that will work, particularly in the event that Iran does not adhere to all of the provisions of the deal. So the question we want to consider in the second panel is really looking at these issues and how does the deal affect the broader economic landscape in the region and beyond. So today we have an opportunity to really grapple with these critical questions and hopefully elevate the public debate on these as the Congress begins to review and eventually debate this deal. We're going to structure our discussion around two panels. The first panel will be on the nuclear deal's regional impact, and that will be chaired by Alon Goldenberg, who heads our CNAS Middle East program. The second panel on the future of Iran's sanctions will be moderated by Zach Goldman, who's Executive Director of NYU Center on Law and Security and also an adjunct senior fellow here at CNAS. But first, we're very pleased to welcome John Wolfstall, who is an old colleague and friend and is since 2014 has served as Senior Director for Arms Control and Nonproliferation in the National Security Council. Prior to that, John was Deputy Director of the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies at the Middlebury Institute. Then from 2009 to 2012, when I worked most intensively with him, he was Special Advisor to the Vice President, Joe Biden, for nuclear security and nonproliferation issues, working on the full range of New START negotiations, North Korea issues, nuclear posture review, the whole gamut of nuclear and nonproliferation issues. Prior to that, he spent many years wearing different hats in the Department of Energy and also in the think tank world, including here in Washington at CSIS. So there's no one that we could have with us this morning to better explain the key elements of this deal and answer some of our questions about the provisions of the deal, but also its broader implications for security in the region. So with that, please join me in welcoming John Wolfstall.
Thanks, Michelle. Thank you very much, Michelle. Good morning, everybody. Michelle is very kind in not mentioning how long we've actually known each other. We started out at the same organization a long time ago. We were both sort of nuclear arms control geeks. Michelle has grown far beyond those limited confines. I couldn't find any other better thing to do, so I've just stayed with nuclear issues for a long time. And for the last 27 years in Washington, I've been working on nonproliferation arms control, verification, nuclear agreements. And so I'm very happy to talk with you today about why I believe and why the President believes that the P5+1 agreement that we've negotiated with Iran is not only in our interests, but by any standard is actually an extremely good nonproliferation agreement. We are proud of it. We think it's an outstanding accomplishment. And if you had told us coming out of either the interim agreement or the Lausanne framework that we would have been able to not only meet but exceed all of the parameters that we had laid out at Lausanne, I think you would have found a lot of skepticism inside the White House, as we have heard outside. But as you look at the agreement now, we can show exactly how we've been able to do exactly that. And what I'd like to do this morning is talk to you about why we think the deal is good, what it actually achieves, and to give you information straight from the source, as opposed to having to listen to a lot of the second and third hand interpretations, some of which are designed to be less than flattering for the agreement. And we can have a discussion, and I'm sure the Q&A will give us some opportunity, hopefully, to bat down some of the suggestions about what the agreement is, but actually is not. So as I said, we believe that this is an extremely good nonproliferation deal. We know that we have the capability to verify it with high confidence. We believe that it's structured in a way that will finally ensure that Iran complies with its nuclear nonproliferation obligations and will do what it sets out to do, which is to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear weapon possessing state. There are things this agreement does not try to do, and therefore it does not do. It does not prevent Iran from funding terrorism. It does not prevent Iran from destabilizing the region. It doesn't prevent the common cold. But it didn't set out to do any of those things. What it's designed to do is structure a verification regime and a sanctions relief regime so that Iran no longer has the ability to sprint quickly to possessing a nuclear weapon. And that in itself is worth doing. There's still a lot of challenges that we recognize and continue to work on in other areas in terms of how we're going to deal with both Iran and the region. But for the deal itself, it does what we aim to do. And it does it not just for a short period of time, for 5 years or 10 years, but it's actually structured to ensure Iran does not acquire nuclear weapons for a long, long time, and probably forever. There are some provisions in this agreement that expire after 10 years. There are some provisions that expire after 15 years. But there are also some that last 25 years and in perpetuity. And for me, some of the most important of those are the fact that Iran is required to implement the additional protocol, the gold standard for nuclear inspections, forever. That Iran is committed not only not to seek or possess or acquire nuclear weapons, but there's a detailed list of activities related to the weaponization of nuclear material that Iran is prohibited from pursuing or possessing forever. And those are spelled out explicitly in the agreement, as opposed to just some vague words that could lead to a debating society exercise with Iran. We've also made very clear that Iran doesn't get anything until it comes into full compliance with the nuclear terms of this agreement. There's no signing bonus. There's no thank you for a negotiating check. Iran has to do a lot of very difficult, very complex, very expensive things to shrink its nuclear capacity down to the limits of the P5+1 agreement before it gets a single dollar. And that means Iran finally has an incentive to do all these things that we've been pushing them to do, including satisfy the International Atomic Energy Agency's requests for access to people, places, and documents in order to complete its investigation into the past possible military dimensions of Iran's program. So all of these things that we've been pushing and negotiating over and worrying about for over a decade, in some cases longer than that, Iran has to do before it gets a single bit of sanctions relief. I also want to make clear, and some people make this argument that, well, aren't you letting Iran off the hook? right? Where's the punishment for having put us through all of this difficulty and for their violations? Iran's economy is rubble. They've been under the most crippling sanctions regime, as Michelle said, probably that's ever been imposed on another country, definitely over a country's nuclear program. They're not going to get that time back. They will get the money that they have earned through oil sales and other things that have been frozen, but they don't get compensation for all of the impact that's been done to their economy. By some calculations, there's somewhere short of $900 billion worth of investments they need in their infrastructure to bring it back up to a functioning level. They might get $100 billion out of the sanctions relief. I've heard the 150 number, but our Treasury Department believes it's closer to $100 billion. So they're still going to be far, far short of the impact that's been done to them. And from my point of view, that's a significant punishment, not only for Iran, but it's a significant deterrent to other states who might say, oh, well, look, Iran is going to be left with a very constrained, highly verified enrichment program. Maybe I should do that too. And our response is fine. If you want to go through 15 years of pain, sanctions, and the threat of destabilizing your own regime, but we don't think that's such a great path for you. So I reject the argument that somehow Iran is getting goodies and rewards for coming back into compliance. They've paid a significant price. So since I'm an advertised nuclear wonk, let me explain to you the nuclear wonk pieces of this agreement and why we think it's a good deal. We have talked about the 4 possible pathways for an Iranian nuclear weapon. These pathways, the use of the Natanz enrichment facility, the use of the Fordow enrichment facility, the use of the Arak reactor that could have produced plutonium for weapons, and the possible covert pathway are all effectively blocked. Natanz will be under the most intrusive verification provisions that exist anywhere in the world. Daily access, surveillance, constant surveillance by cameras, the right for regular, daily, and even special access if necessary. I've used the expression that if a mouse decides to move into Natanz, we will know about it. And so we believe effectively that capability will be blocked during the course of the agreement. The Fordow facility, not only will it not have uranium enrichment centrifuges, it will not be permitted to have any uranium in it. So just the detection of a uranium isotope will be grounds for claiming that Iran has violated the agreement and could lead to the reimposition of sanctions. And so the Fordow pathway is essentially blocked because there won't be any uranium, nuclear material, or uranium enrichment allowed there. The Arak reactor, if there are any nuclear engineers or nuclear reactor engineers in the audience, let me know. What I'll explain very briefly is that while all reactors produce plutonium, some are very good at producing weapons-grade plutonium, the special isotope you need. The Arak reactor, as it was designed, would have been very good at producing plutonium for weapons, could have produced 2 weapons worth of plutonium per year. Under the way it's being redesigned, the fact that its core is going to be ripped out and rendered inoperable, and the new core will be designed in such a way that it would take several years, perhaps as many as 4 years, for Iran doing special operations that are easily detected in the first several weeks to produce enough plutonium for 1 nuclear weapon. They would have to insert and remove 10 different cores of nuclear fuel for them to produce enough plutonium for the first weapon. At each one of those shutdown and reloads, the IAEA would detect it, be able to go, and therefore Iran would be in verifiable violation of the agreement. So we believe that the Arak pathway is effectively cut off. And this is, I think, extremely important because most people that I've worked with and talked with believe that the breakout scenario using declared facilities is really not one that we have to worry about. If there's one thing the International Atomic Energy Agency is really, really good at, it's monitoring existing declared nuclear facilities. What we have been particularly worried about is Iran repeating its past behavior of developing covert facilities, building a duplicate pathway to get the nuclear material it might need for a nuclear weapon. For 2 reasons, we believe that this agreement effectively blocks that pathway. One, what we haven't talked about yet, is that in addition to the nuclear facilities, Iran's whole fuel cycle, from uranium mines, where you get uranium out of the ground, to where it is processed and turned into oxide, hexafluoride, and a gas that can then be enriched, all of that is under monitoring by the International Atomic Energy Agency. They can't pull a rock out of the ground with us being able to find out about it. And if they do so, they are in violation of the agreement. So we have the ability to ensure that Iran doesn't duplicate their uranium fuel cycle through the inspection process. And in addition, Iran is prohibited from getting sources of uranium outside the country. They would need to import a lot of uranium ore. It's not something you can put in your briefcase. You actually have to ship it in by supertanker or by multiple airplane loads, and we're actually very good at interdicting Iranian behavior. We've been watching them very closely for a long time. And the ability of our intelligence community and of the IEA to detect those sort of activities goes up significantly under this agreement, because the IEA is going to be crawling all over that country. And our intelligence community will be watching to ensure the verifiability of this agreement in a way that gives us very high confidence that Iran will not be able to clandestinely build a duplicate set of facilities. And this is one of the great, I think, misfortunes of the debate we've been having so far with Congress. Even before we submitted all of the documents under the JCPOA to Congress on Sunday, the House Republicans introduced a resolution of disapproval. They hadn't even seen the intelligence community's assessment of their ability to verify this agreement and of their belief that this agreement can, in fact, effectively be monitored before they rejected it or attempted to reject it. And it's not the sort of debate that is based on facts. It's the debate that's based on politics or on rumor. And what we are really encouraging people in the Senate and the House to do is sit down, read the agreement, get briefings from our scientific community, from our technical community, including Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz, who was instrumental in negotiating this agreement, and in hearing from the principals themselves, including Secretary Kerry, for why we believe this deal is in our interest. And we believe that the more we have that conversation, the more support for this agreement we will have. Just one more word about the longer-term basis of this agreement. There are things in this agreement that expire after a certain period of time. There's a lot of talk you will hear about Iran's ability to do advanced research and development on the next generation of centrifuges. And it's true. After 8.5 years under this agreement, they can begin to do some basic mechanical testing on centrifuges that they had been developing. After 10 years, they can begin to deploy a limited controlled number of some of their more advanced centrifuges, but in a way that gives us predictability. They have to declare their research and development plan to the International Atomic Energy Agency. That is a plan that will be binding, so that it gives us, again, some predictability about how the Iranian enrichment capability may grow over those years. But Iran is still limited to having only 300 kilograms of low-enriched uranium for 15 years. So those centrifuges may come into deployment, but they still don't have enough nuclear material to make a bomb. 300 kg is only enough for 1/4 of one nuclear weapon. And so that 15-year restriction is extremely important. The monitoring over Iran's enrichment goes on, as I said, in perpetuity. The monitoring over Iran's ability to mine and acquire the uranium it would need to feed into those centrifuges lasts for at least 25 years. So in the first 25 years of this agreement, we will know if Iran makes any attempt to increase their uranium capabilities and activities in a way that's inconsistent with our interpretation of the agreement and of their obligations under that agreement. And then this is the last point I'll make, because this is, as Michelle pointed out, and I know you'll talk about it later, the snack pack provision and the way we will enforce this agreement. We've had non-proliferation agreements in the past. I worked for a month in North Korea implementing the agreed framework back in 1995, 1996. The agreed framework was 4 pages long. Did not have access to the type of intrusive verification provisions that the IEA will have in Iran. But in my mind, it demonstrates that we have learned the lessons of history from both the Iraq example and from North Korea example, that you need to have a highly intrusive inspection regime that has the ability to go needs to go any place that we believe that there is suspicious nuclear activity going on as soon as we need to get there. If Iran doesn't provide that access, if Iran violates this agreement, we don't have to go to the Russians and we don't have to go to the Chinese in order to reimpose the sanctions regime that's in place today. The way we've negotiated the snapback provisions, really a very clever lawyerly approach to this, is any member of this agreement can go to the UN Security Council and introduce a resolution to continue the suspension of sanctions. And any veto-wielding member of the UN Security Council, including the United States, can then veto that resolution, and the sanctions will immediately go back into effect. Which means the United States has the unilateral ability to reimpose sanctions if Iran violates that deal. In North Korea, there was no self-enforcement mechanism. In the Non-Proliferation Treaty, there is no self-enforcement mechanism. You need to go to the Security Council. You need to get the international coalition to impose a penalty. We were unwilling to let go of that ability to reimpose sanctions, and under this agreement, not only did the Russians and Chinese accept it, but the Iranians accepted it too. And that gives us some confidence that Iran actually intends to abide by this agreement, but we have made sure that the verification provisions give us the capability to ensure that that is the case, and if they do not, to reimpose those sanctions and to go back to the status quo ante as needed. So with that, let me finish, and then I'm happy to take any questions that you have, and thank you for your attention.
John, thanks for that overview of the deal and some of the thinking behind the various provisions. I wanted to start with a point that you made about, the sunset clauses associated with various provisions, and I understand that, some of the provisions go on indefinitely, but there are critics of the deal who've said basically, even if Iran completely complies with the agreement, at the end of 15 years, when some of the key limitations come off, Iran will basically potentially be a nuclear threshold state. How do you respond to that concern? And are there other things we can do outside of the agreement to try to either prevent that eventuality or deal with it?
So, we've heard this concern a lot, and it's generally in the context that, if Iran has this ability to quickly develop nuclear weapons, that this will spark an arms race in the region, that the Saudis and others will have to match that capability. If that were true, we would have seen those countries rapidly developing nuclear capabilities today, because Iran is not constrained, had not been constrained, has 19,000 installed centrifuges, and yet what we see is not these countries saying we have to have nuclear weapons too. We see them working with us to figure out how we can confront Iranian behavior in the region that threatens them and threatens us and our allies. But I think there's a very basic realization here, which is the same that the last administration had, which is Iran has already crossed the threshold of knowledge of how to build a centrifuge, how to enrich uranium. And so to a certain extent, even if we had gotten an agreement which said you can't have any centrifuges for 15 years, you're not allowed to have any enriched uranium, that knowledge would still be there. And we would still have the concern that at some point Iran could quickly sprint to rebuild that capability to use it for military purposes. And so I think there's a recognition that what we have now is an ability to constrain their capability for a long time, and that even beyond that, we have the ability to watch their capability so that if they try to go towards a nuclear weapon, we still have a lot of time with which to respond, either using diplomatic and economic means, which have been effective in this case, or in the last resort to use any means at our disposal to fulfill the president's guidance, which is that Iran will not be permitted to have a nuclear weapon. So I think we have the ability, working with our allies, to ensure that they don't seek or feel the need to match Iran. And we believe that under the agreement, we have the ability to watch them in such a way that they won't be able to ever reach that end state.
Can you talk us through, if the Congress were to actually muster the votes to reject this with, a veto-proof majority, which I understand is unlikely, but if that were to occur and the deal were to fall apart, can you describe how you see that scenario unfolding for Iran, for the United States, for the region? Sure.
Well, I can, but I think also, the President and Secretary Kerry have been laying this argument out very effectively. Let's go through the logic here. And also let's keep in mind, this would be true whether the UN Security Council had acted yesterday or not, right? The Security Council resolution doesn't remove Congress's ability to vote against this deal and to block it. In the simplest terms, we get the worst of both worlds. The rest of the world essentially would be free to implement this agreement with Iran. The UN Security Council resolutions and the sanctions would come off. The sanctions that have crippled Iran's economy would come off. And Iran would not be required to meet any of the nuclear restrictions that are contained in this agreement. So they would have enrichment and they would have sanctions relief at the same time. And as Secretary Kerry said this morning, not only would that be the case, but if we then tried to go back to the international community and say, no, we need sanctions to constrain their nuclear capabilities, or we need UN Security Council backing to take military action, what are the odds that the United States, having brought the entire world to the negotiating table and having signed this deal and then rejected it, would be able to muster that sort of international leadership? It's just, as the Secretary said, it's just impossible to imagine. And so while Congress does have the ability to block this agreement, we think that that outcome is so disastrous that saner minds will prevail in the Congress. And we hope, and recognize that hope isn't always a strategy, that the engagement with the Congress and the details of this agreement will show reasonable skeptics that in fact it does what it says it can do, and therefore that it is in the interest of the Congress to support it.
Okay. I wanted to walk through a couple of the specific provisions that have come under, fire, and ask to draw you out a little bit on the administration's thinking behind them. So let's start with inspections and monitoring. The question is whether the inspections are really sufficient to catch any cheating that Iran might undertake. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, as many of you have read, has come out publicly and said, look, if the system will basically take 24 days to get from raising a concern to actually getting on site to look at an activity, and in that time Iran could clean up or hide anything that it was doing to cheat. And another criticism that's been raised is the IAEA, particularly given the Iranians' restrictions on who can be on IAEA teams. I think they're saying it has to be someone who already has countries that have diplomatic relations with Iran. Does the IAEA actually have the skills and capacity to implement this regime fully and successfully and so forth? Can you speak to those criticisms of the inspections regime and tell us how you would respond?
Sure. You're much more diplomatic than I am. What Prime Minister Netanyahu said was, it's like a meth dealer. They could just flush the stuff down the toilet. And what I said is that's going to be one radioactive toilet, and you are not going to want to use it. I'll give you an example. So Dr. Olli Heinonen, who was the head of the Safeguards program at the IAEA, has laid out a scenario which he says shows that the 24-day period, which is the longest it could take to get access. It could also take as little as 24 hours. So there's a provision for the agreement. And by the way, it's important, the way this agreement is structured, if the IAEA requests access and Iran refuses, the votes of the United States, the UK, France, Germany, and the EU can back that request, and Russia and China and Iran cannot block the access. So in 24 days, Iran would be legally required to provide that access in the extremis, and if it didn't, it would be in clear violation of the JCPOA. But we believe it could actually take place in much less time. So the example that Dr. Heinonen laid out was, well, let's assume you're at the very end of the weaponization process, and you were going to turn uranium metal in a furnace into the shapes needed. So you would take highly enriched uranium, you would convert it to oxide, you then convert it to fluoride, you then convert it to metal, and then you would be able to put it in this furnace. And that furnace chamber could operate in a room that you might be able to sanitize within 24 days. Well, Iran's not allowed to have highly enriched uranium. We detect that within hours of their attempt to produce it. They're not allowed to remove it from a safeguarded facility ever. We would detect that within probably hours, if not days. They're not allowed to reconvert to oxide or to fluoride or to metal, and all of those things are things we could detect. So what he's basically saying is they would have to go through years of effort, multiple steps, recreate an entire process that we know we have high confidence that we could detect before they could get to that room which they could clean up in 24 hours. And so we just don't view those scenarios as credible. And this is not just my poor chemistry and physics experience coming to bear here. These are the leading safeguards experts, the leading engineering experts in the world who have come up with this program and that the IC believes is going to be effective. So we think the 24-day period it's possible there are small things that Iran might be able to hide. Can you prevent a guy with a pad of paper from developing what a bomb might look like on a pad? But that's not what it takes to build nuclear weapons. You need a whole infrastructure. And I'm sorry, the second part of your question got to...
Was the IAEA capacity.
Right, the IAEA. So there are two answers to this. The short answer is, look, the IAEA is the group that got it right in Iraq when we got it wrong. These are people that knew that the allegation that Iraq was trying to get uranium from Africa, that those documents were a forgery. They figured it out in 36 hours. We spent months backing them. So the IAEA is the only organization that has a proven track record for doing this work. But we also have been working with the IAEA not only for decades and decades to build up their technical capability, but for several years to help them develop the technologies, to have the resources and the personnel that they're going to need to do this job. It is going to be relatively expensive for the IAEA. Could take several $1 million additional effort over the first several years. They need to install specialized modern equipment, which is explicitly allowed in the agreement. But we have very high confidence that the IAEA is not only up to this task, but that they've got a demonstrated capability that gives them the right role in the center of this agreement.
Another aspect of the agreement that's been, sort of highlighted is the provisions related to research and development. This is one of the hardest things to monitor and really understand in detail. My understanding is that as of year 8, certain limitations on research and development start to be lifted or relaxed. And there's some concern that, again, around year 15, Iran's breakout time could be close to 0. So the question is, how do you see, are the limitations on R&D adequate? How do they play with regard to breakout time? And again, it kind of gets back to this question of, how do we deal with the fact that Iran could end up very close to a threshold, even if it's fully in compliance with the agreement by the end of its terms?
So we would have very much liked an agreement that says Iran can have no centrifuges at all. We tried that when they had 164 centrifuges back in the Bush administration. They said no. We then launched into a tremendous pressure program. They went up to 19,000 centrifuges. So it's pretty clear to us over the last decade that Iran is going to insist, no matter what, on some capability to produce enriched uranium. We believe that we've negotiated an agreement that can do that without the threat of Iran having the ability to produce a nuclear weapon. But over time, Iran will have the right to increase its capacity in a way that is declared, in a way that is very strictly monitored, and so that as the time it would take them to produce enough nuclear material for a weapon is smaller and smaller, our inspection regime would continue unabated, and we'd have the ability to monitor that. Is that a perfect world? Absolutely not. We would have much preferred one where they didn't have any centrifuges, but this is a negotiation, and we had to find some middle ground. What we have is some clear statements by Iran that they must meet, that those increases will be declared and that will be under inspection, that they will be consistent with a peaceful nuclear program, and that even as the breakout time reduces, that they are still restricted from doing anything in the weaponization area, that they're still restricted from doing things in the research and development area that would help them turn that material into a nuclear weapon. There are also, quite frankly, the right inherent in the part of any sovereign state to say, we signed this agreement, we implemented it, Iran is now behaving in a way that's inconsistent with its peaceful commitments. It's producing HEU even though it doesn't have a use for it. It's stockpiling large amounts of HEU and is doing it in a form that's inconsistent with its nuclear program. At any point at that stage, the United States could say to its friends and allies, look, we don't think Iran is abiding by its agreement anymore. We think they're too close, and we need to make sure that they remain incentivized to stay on the right side of the line. And so we always have recourse in the future, whether that's 10, 20, 30, 40 years, to take action to ensure that Iran doesn't acquire a nuclear weapon, because they will be bound by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They will have the JCPOA additional restrictions on weaponization that if they violate, we still possess our rights to confront them on.
So let's talk about, one of the instruments that's been talked about in, confronting Iran with any kind of cheating or violation is the snapback sanctions provision. I have a couple of questions. The first is, the agreement sets out this very detailed timeline, including this notion of implementation day, which is the point at which Iran will have taken several verifiable steps to comply with the nuclear dimension of the agreement, and then implementation day is when the sanctions will be lifted. First of all, what's the sort of expected timeline for that? Is it 3 months, 6 months, 9 months? I mean, what do we think? What kind of timeline are we looking
This
at?
is the next over-under, right? You know, it's
Yeah.
like how many extensions will we have on the negotiation was the last game. We don't know because we actually have to do relatively few things to get ourselves into a position to implement. Iran has to do a lot of things. And it really, as Iran asked us, well, you know, how quickly can you lift the sanction? And we said, well, it depends. How quickly can you rip your centrifuges out of Fordow and put them under storage? How quickly can you implement your agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency for access to Parchin, for access to the experts that they've requested? So the rough estimate is that it might take 6 months. Iran has some technical challenges, particularly as it comes to eliminating their stocks of uranium. They're going to have to convert a lot of that. They're going to have to sell some of it. They're going to have to do some work on the reactor. So if they really are incentivized, and we think they are, it could take 6 months, but it could take longer. I don't think there's any expectation that it's going to happen in a couple of months because there's a lot of work to do.
Okay. The other question about snapback is more to do with political will, both in the sense that over time, how do you sustain the political will to, to enforce the agreement? And secondly, the question of, if Iran were, rather than cheating sort of in a major way, if they were to sort of death by 1,000 cuts, little things on the margins that might slowly help them creep into a different position, but each one by itself would not seem to be enough to trigger snapback. I mean, how do you address those concerns?
Sure, and I think this is another case where we really have worked to learn the lessons of history because we saw our mechanism in Iraq after 1991 and after leading up to 2003 was, well, is that really going back to war over, right? They didn't let the inspectors into a nuclear palace for a week, but are really going to redeploy 100,000 troops to Saudi Arabia and go back to war. We have the ability under this agreement to reimpose the full suite of sanctions through the UN Security Council snapback, but we also have the ability to work with the EU or to reimpose unilateral sanctions in a domestic sense, because the president has a lot of waiver authority on different acts that he could exercise in response to Iranian non-compliance or what we call implementation ambiguities. And there's a legal standard here that basically talks about proportionality and do you have a just cause? Are they a material breach or are they simply violating technical provisions of the agreement? So we do have tools other than the big sledgehammer of snapback. I'm sorry, I forgot the first part of your question, Michelle.
So when was the timing, and then you answered it, and then what if the less than egregious violations occur?
Oh no, it was the political will, and
Yes,
this is
thank you.
so this is where having been around for a little while, you and I sort of remember we started working to try and head off Iran's nuclear efforts when Ronald Reagan was president, right? We were concerned that the Soviets were going to take over the Bushehr nuclear reactor project that the West Germans had abandoned back in the 70s. The Bush administration really began to work with Russia and try to cut off some of the nuclear cooperation that was going on with Iran because we were concerned about their activities. Everybody said we were crazy, right? You're still upset over the hostages and you're out to get the Iranian regime because you don't like them. And it turns out we were able to sustain that effort and increase the sanctions over 20 plus years. Preventing Iran from having a nuclear weapon is not one president's issue, right? It's been a national commitment for almost a generation now. And I think that any president is going to have the same goal in mind, which that a nuclear Iran is so destabilizing to our friends and allies in the region and so threatening to us that the implementation of this agreement is critical. Now, if in 30 years there's a better way to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon, then I think the president, he or she at that time, could decide what that path might be. But for now, not only is this the best thing and the best way to do it, but it's really the only effective way to do it.
Yeah. So I'd like to open up the questions to the audience now. When I call on you, please stand up. I think we have some microphones around in the aisles, and please state your name, your affiliation, and ask a question. Don't give a speech. So any questions from the audience? Yes, sir, right here.
Ken Meyercord, World Docs. Didn't the Iranians begin their enrichment program because we denied them the opportunity to buy enriched uranium on the open market? And if they had been able to do that, wouldn't it have been easy to verify how much enriched uranium they were purchasing and of what type? In fact, might we not today be in that situation of a perfect world, as you describe it, where Iran doesn't have any centrifuges? So in retrospect, was the refusal to allow Iran to buy enriched uranium openly a mistake?
Hindsight's always 20/20. I think you could make the argument that we should have allowed Iran to buy into Eurodiff, which was an effort they tried to buy 10% of back in the 1980s. But it wasn't those activities that led Iran to have a nuclear weapons program. We know that Iran was seeking nuclear weapons prior to 2003, and that wasn't because they couldn't buy uranium on the open market for the Tehran research reactor. So there are things in hindsight we could have done. I would argue most effectively we should have taken the deal in the early 2000s when Iran said, let us keep our 164 centrifuges and not feed any uranium into them. That would have been a great deal. But I can't go back and reset the clock.
You should tell our intelligence agencies that Iran has a nuclear weapons program because they haven't gotten the word.
Actually, the declassified NIE says that they stopped their nuclear weapons program in 2003.
Okay, other questions? Yes, right here, down here in the front.
Thank you. Jonas Paul-Pistner with the Embassy of Denmark, heading the Foreign Policy Department. I was going to ask you about Congress a little bit more. I mean, the president the other day in the press conference was saying that he was hoping, when laying out the facts, the majority in Congress would support that. Then he sort of stopped himself and said, but this is Washington. And so I was going to ask you a little bit more about what sort of facts you see that actually sort of convince in Congress among the people that haven't already signed up to a resolution of disapproval. Yeah. And second would be a nuclear technical question about the managed access. There's both sort of additional protocol and then the stipulations on managed access. Which do you see as sort of most sort of useful in enforcing? Because actually the additional protocol has also quite quick sort of access, but doesn't have the sort of snapback options that the agreement has.
When you join the government, there's a indoctrination program, there's a orientation program. They need to add a line which is never correct the president. So I think the president is right here, which is look, we would love a majority to support this agreement, but we recognize that the political environment in this Congress would not get majority approval for anything the president does, right? This is a Congress that rejected the Disabilities Treaty. What we are focused on is trying to get reasonable people to look at the details of the agreement, reasonable people that understand the agreement in Congress to talk to their colleagues who sometimes defer to other members of the Senate and the House. There are members of the Senate who are physicists, and they tend to sort of have a proxy, not quite a proxy, but they definitely tend to be sort of touchstones for other senators and congressmen. So we hope that we will get a sufficient number of people to support the agreement, but obviously tactically what we're looking at is are there enough to show that the president can sustain a veto so that we don't have to go to that situation. In terms of the provisions of the additional protocol and otherwise, we could have just said, look, implement the additional protocol, but we knew that that wasn't sufficient. Because under the additional protocol, a state is required to provide access, in some cases as few as 2 hours or 24 hours, but then has the right to refuse. And there's no clear dispute resolution mechanism. What we negotiated was sort of on top of the additional protocol, these provisions that make sure the IAEA's right will be backed up, and that if it's not backed up and Iran refuses, that they will be punished. That is the deterrent. That is the incentive to make sure that Iran doesn't repeat this game, because we've seen this in the past, right? And we have this as well in arms control agreements, right? We negotiate with the Russians, and we say, well, you can only have this number of weapons, you can only have that number of weapons, let's do it for 10 years, right? I look back, this will warm your cockles, your heart. SALT was a 5-year agreement, right? This is when we were trying to kill each other with the Soviet Union. 5 years with sufficient transparency to sort of lock in an agreement. We know that we needed more than the additional protocol, and that's why we think the details of this agreement really satisfy our concern.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Thank you. Steve Shahida, I'm here in my personal capacity. First of all, thank you very much for giving peace and diplomacy a chance. Both my parents and many friends and family living there. My question is, there's so much emphasis on cheating and punishment, including here today. although it might be obvious, can you speak to Iran's incentives for full and continued compliance?
Well, look, we've recognized for a long, long time that shockingly there's politics in Iran too. We decided a long time ago we're not going to pick sides. We may think that one group is better than another, one leader is easier to work with than another, but the Iranian people and the Iranian state have to decide what they want to do here. They have a legal commitment in the Non-Proliferation Treaty that they voluntarily signed up to never to possess nuclear weapons. The IAEA has found that they were in violation of their safeguards agreements by conducting activities outside the frame. So the Bush administration had said, as we have said, that if Iran can reassure the international community about their peaceful intentions of their nuclear program, that they can come back into compliance and demonstrate their fealty to that obligation, that they could resume the activities of a normal nuclear state. Doesn't mean we're not going to have challenges with them because they are engaging activities that threaten us and our allies. But the incentive is, as Iran has said, is we want to be treated like everybody else. We want to be able to do international commerce, to sell oil on the open market, to have our children study abroad, to do trade and engage with the rest of the outside world. That's a very powerful incentive for a very proud country. And a country that has been isolated because of their nuclear activities predominantly for now over a generation. We think that could bring other benefits. It may also cause other problems for us, and we're prepared to deal with them as they come. But one thing we've recognized is that we benefit if Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons, and Iran has said that they will benefit if they are released from the nuclear-driven sanctions. And from our point of view, that seems like a reasonable bargain if both sides can work together to verify their implementation.
Okay. I think we have time for one last question. Sir, back in the middle there. Raise your hand. Yep.
I'm Staff Lieutenant Colonel Ahmed, the Deputy of Egyptian Defense Attaché. The Secretary Carter was in the region and have visiting to different countries. My question is there is any military procedures parallel with the political one? Second question, what's your assessment for the security arrangement in the region after the deal? Thank you.
Whether we'd had a completed agreement or not, we would have continued with our very close defense consultations in the region. We believe, if anything, the provisions of this agreement mean that we can adjust our military planning in a different direction. We have obviously prepared for a full range of contingencies should Iran continue to be in violation, or had they continue to be in violation and move closer to a nuclear weapons capability. That's an area where we will continue to plan for, but it's not as acute as dealing with other Iranian activities, whether it's related to terrorism support, arms shipment. And so we'll continue to focus our efforts on the full suite of contingencies that we need to work on. Secretary Carter is talking about exactly those arrangements in the region now. And you saw with the Gulf Cooperation Council Summit at Camp David, the leaders of the Gulf countries come in to talk about how we now deal with Iran after this agreement. Because we recognize that this agreement doesn't solve all the challenges. We are prepared to do more to work with our allies, but we're also asking our allies to do more themselves. It's not a question of their commitment. They spend a lot more money than Iran. The Iranian defense budget might be $15 billion. It pales in comparison to what the Saudis and the UAE spend. But what we need for them is to use that investment to increase their capabilities to really confront the threats that we see from Iran and Iranian proxies. So that's an effort that's going to go on and will continue to go on. We think it's actually vastly improved over where we were just several years ago, but it's something that we're going to continue to work on very closely.
Yeah. So your question and your answer are the perfect segue to the next panel on regional security implications. So John, thank you so much for joining us. Really very, very enlightening and helpful to have your detailed explanations of the elements of the agreement and how the administration is thinking about it going forward. So again, please join me in thanking John Wolfstoff. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean.
Yeah, really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, everybody. We got, I'm sure, a great briefing from John on where the administration's perspective is on all this, and the actual technical elements of the agreement itself, which is a really great way to set the basic framework for this discussion now. What we thought we would do here is have a discussion. We have three great panelists speaking about different elements of how the region is going to react to the nuclear agreement. What can we expect? And really we have, there's a lot of protagonists in the region, but I think we can say there are three fundamental major protagonists. One being Iran and what happens internally inside of Iran and what kind of policies and behavior does the Iranian regime pursue in the aftermath. Two being the Gulf states overall, but most importantly among those, Saudi Arabia, and how obviously the concerns that it's expressed about the nuclear agreement, even if they're much more quiet, I think you can still sense the signals coming out of Saudi, and we know Ash Carter will be there later this week to have some conversations with the Saudi leadership about the agreement. And finally, Israel, where I think the objections have been much more vociferous and clearly stated by the Prime Minister, and the tension now that exists in the U.S.-Israel relationship to basically going forward, and obviously the Secretary of Defense is there today and meeting with the Prime Minister, I believe, right now, if that might still be going on. So anyway, I thought what we would do is we'd have a few minutes of Q&A with each of our three panelists, and I'll introduce them one at a time as we have a discussion, and then we can open it up after that for questions. So we will start with Dr. Suzanne Maloney, who is the Interim Deputy Director of the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution and a Senior Fellow in the Brookings Center for Middle East Policy, where her research is focused on Iran and Persian Gulf energy. Suzanne has published multiple books on Iran, focused on the economy and the internal dynamics inside the Islamic Republic. Before joining Brookings, she served on the Secretary of State's Policy Planning Board, and really is just one of the best people in town to talk to about what's going on inside of Iran. So we're very happy to have her with us today. And Suzanne, I'd like to start by asking you, we heard the president when he announced the agreement this past week lay out very clearly that this is an arms control agreement, say that there still are regional differences that exist with Iran on Syria, Iraq, Israel, Yemen, but we also heard him talk about the possibilities of a new direction inside of Iran, that the agreement could lend itself to potential for over time a shift in the overall Islamic Republic's foreign policy and internal dynamics and the empowerment of more pragmatic voices and forces. And I'm interested to get your assessment. How do you see the internal politics playing out in Iran in the aftermath of the agreement over the next few years in terms of these different factions and groups?
Thanks, Alon. I hope you all can hear me. These are nifty microphones and beyond my technological capabilities. But I really want to thank you and CNAS for organizing such a great group of people, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the conversation among all of the people here and everyone in the audience. I think the sort of question of what does this mean for Iran is perhaps the most interesting, and in a way it underlies everything that we're doing with this deal and everything that will happen in the way that it's implemented. As the president said, the deal itself is not predicated on the assumption of political change and progress in Iran, but it is infused in everything that is contained within the deal, including a lot of the provisions that will, I think, effectively make it more complicated and potentially even more difficult for the United States to deal with Iran, the other threats posed by Iran around the region in terms of imposing sanctions or undertaking other actions that the Iranians can then assert are in some way contrary to the spirit or obligations of the United States under this deal. So in effect, should Iran not change, it's going to be very difficult and I think inherently full of tension to continue to see this deal hold over the course of its entire lifespan. That said, I am not optimistic about short-term change in Iran. This is really more of a historical perspective than it is a reflection of current dynamics, although I think the current dynamics matter. There's a perception of Rouhani as a kind of successor to the previous smiling, urbane cleric, Mohammad Khatami, But within the world of Iranian politics, they come from very different factions. Rouhani, despite the sense that he managed to persuade many of the reformist and oppositionists within the Iranian population to come around and support him during the 2013 elections, is someone whose factional alignments within Iran have always laid very clearly with the conservative camp, albeit the more pragmatic wing of that conservative camp. He has found ways, I think, to evolve his views to some extent, but ultimately his interests are in preserving the regime. And I think that extends to Mohammad Javad Zarif, the foreign minister, the negotiator of this deal, who in many ways has served as the face of a new Iran for much of the media and certainly for those who were involved in the negotiations. So I'm not persuaded Rouhani, in effect, is looking to wholly transform the Iranian regime to begin with. But even if, for example, he were, I think that what we've seen in the past is that when Iranian politicians try to move the system in a more moderate direction, there are a number of factors that intercede to make that difficult, if not impossible. And we saw a lot of them play out over the course of both the Rafsanjani presidency, the president who took over Iran in the aftermath of the war with Iraq and tried to reconstruct the economy, as well as during the reformist presidency of Mohammad Khatami. First and foremost, the system is really stacked against moderation. The levers of power that remain in the hands of those who would oppose any kind of moderation, either political moderation within Iran or moderation of Iran's foreign policy, are very firmly in the hands of extremists. And they're willing to use those levers of power, whether it's the power of the judiciary, the power of the security forces, or simply the use of violence on a societal basis. So that in and of itself makes it, I think, very difficult. And what we've also seen is that in the kind of competitive political landscape of Iran, extremists tend to do better. In fact, the Iranian population itself has turned repeatedly against some of the moderates, whether it was Rafsanjani or Khatami, out of frustration that they're unable to get their agendas implemented. And I think that's one of the potential challenges that will face Rouhani were he to be interested in making some kind of a systemic change. But my fundamental presumption is that for the Iranians, this, as Rafsanjani and some previous efforts to moderate Iran were, this is not a systemic change. This is selective. It is an attempt at damage control to solve a problem, to get Iran out from under the yoke of sanctions, rather than a kind of transformational shift in the way that Iran approaches the world. The final issue that I think I just mentioned, and we'll probably get into some of the other pieces of our discussion, is just the extent to which, even the best laid plans tend to go awry with respect to Iran and within Iran. And so even where you've had presidents or political figures who've tried to push Iran in a more moderate direction in the past, what we found is that events intercede. This happened in the aftermath of the Gulf War. This happened with Khatami, albeit more internally. And I think that when we see the array of threats on the landscape and the challenges that Iran itself is facing around the region, I think we see a lot of impetus for a continuing assertiveness in its regional foreign policy, and potentially the empowerment of those who really are absolutely convinced on retaining the current system and its current balance of power.
Let me follow up with you, Suzanne, on one question here. I think, and I very much agree that historically, if you look at Iran, the moderates don't often win out. But in this case, they did seem to win out. You could make the argument, at least on the nuclear program, that if you asked me at least 2 or 3 years ago, are you going to have Rouhani elected, who, he's not a reformer, but more pragmatic, let's say, certainly than an Ahmadinejad. And if you were going to actually get to a nuclear agreement with them that limits their nuclear program, I would have said, I'll tell you, in 2012, I would have said you're crazy. And here we are. And so does that speak to, is there, even if it's not the most likely scenario, is it a possibility, or should we be thinking about at least ways to help move that along or leave that possibility open, or is your view that the likelihood is so low that really we just need to be thinking about it more from just an assumption that this is not fundamentally going to change the overall system, or their overall, even forget the overall system, their overall foreign policy?
Look, let me just predicate everything, and I should have said this at the outset. This is Iran. If you try to predict what's going to happen in Iran, you're automatically going to get yourself into trouble, and you're automatically going to come up short against the reality of a country that has proven to be unpredictable and defy most of the expectations of certainly those of us who sit this far away time and time again. So anything is possible when it comes to Iran, and that's one of the things that Rouhani said in his inaugural speech. Anything is possible if this nuclear deal can be solved. But my fundamental presumption is not that the moderates won with respect to this deal. My fundamental presumption is that the system got what it wanted, which is a way out of a problem. And that, in effect, is why the nuclear agreement is not likely to be upended by any party within the Iranian political system, so long as the terms as we understand them, as released last week, fundamentally stand and aren't altered during the course of the political debate here. I think the Iranians are not happy. The political system is not happy about having to give up a certain number of its obsolete centrifuges or to put much of its LEU into some non-usable form and to take these other measures and to deal with the kind of inspection and verification regime that was put in place as a result of the deal. But it was a price the system itself was willing to pay. It was not something that Rouhani and Zarif foisted upon an unwilling Islamic Republic. This was a consensus move 2 years ago that the internal disarray that Ahmadinejad had caused and the external price of sanctions and isolation from the international financial system and from the world more generally was a price that the Islamic Republic didn't want to pay. And the only question that has remained between June 2013 and the finalization of this deal has been, what price would Iran be willing to pay in order to get over this problem? And I think what they agreed to last week was an improvement upon what they've previously put forward. But it was not a cost that I think Khamenei or others were unwilling to pay, and I think that's why we were able to get the deal.
Thanks. I'm sure we'll come back to you in a couple minutes. I want to move on now to Melissa Dalton. Melissa is a fellow and chief of staff at the CSIS International Security Program, where her research focuses on security cooperation, U.S. defense policy in the Middle East, and defense strategy and policy. Prior to CSIS, she served in a number of positions at the U.S. Department of Defense in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and I actually had the opportunity to work with Melissa in the Middle East office when she was the desk officer for Syria and Lebanon for a couple of years, and she also had the opportunity, I know, to work very closely with CNES's CEO, Michel Flournoy. So, Melissa, I want to ask you really about the regional, the Arab response, and really the GCC response, first of all. I mean, President Obama met with Saudi Foreign Minister Adel Al-Jubeir on Friday. Secretary Carter is in Jeddah this week. It seems like the initial Gulf state public reaction has been to support the agreement, but at the same time, you can look at folks like Prince Bandar, Prince Turki bin Faisal, and the sort of former Saudi officials who sometimes speak more freely and really represent in some ways the regime or the leadership, and you see a very different sort of reaction. So, how do you think they're taking this, and what is the Gulf states' major concerns? Why are the Saudis so worried about this agreement?
Great, thanks so much for having me on, and I too look forward to a great discussion here today with my fellow panelists and with the audience. I think I would characterize the public reaction from the Arabs, and primarily the GCC states, as resigned acceptance. The administration has gone to great strides in the run-up to sealing the deal with Iran, to conduct diplomatic outreach bilaterally, multilaterally. President Obama convened the Camp David summit earlier this spring to attempt to assure our Arab partners that we have their interests in mind, that particularly their security interests in mind as the United States pursues this, or has pursued this deal. But privately, as you mentioned, Alon, I think the deal very much feeds long-standing fears in the Gulf in a number of ways. I think that there has been actually a trust deficit that has emerged amongst the United States and primarily its Gulf partners over the last few years, starting with the precipitation of the Iraq-Afghanistan drawdown in the region, the announcement of the rebalance to the Asia-Pacific, And then the perception in the Gulf that the United States has focused almost exclusively on the Iranian nuclear issue and not really investing or paying as much attention to the asymmetric capabilities of the Iranians and the political influence of Iran in the region, which I believe our Arab partners think is a far more significant threat than the nuclear issue. So there's, as I mentioned, this trust deficit that has deepened, and with the Iranian nuclear deal now sealed and questions, though, remaining in terms of how solid it will be going forward, I think that there's a great deal of skepticism expressed privately, and as you mentioned, by some of the surrogates, the former government officials in the Gulf, in terms of how credible the deal is going to be. Is Iran going to actually live up to its commitments? Will the lifting of economic sanctions actually flush Iranian coffers with money that might be used to further build asymmetric capabilities in the region and allow Iran to poke around in places like Yemen, Syria, and Iraq in ways that our Arab partners view as very destabilizing and contrary to their interests? So that's how I see their read of the deal.
And as you're saying, the administration, we had John Wolfstall here earlier, has tried to go out of its way early on, with this Camp David summit, with all the consultations they're now having. There seems to be a very robust effort to try and reassure the Gulf states. Do you think it's working so far, or what's your assessment of the American approach thus far?
I think that there's some good initial steps. I think the instincts are right to bring together or attempt to bring together the political echelon in the Gulf, with efforts to bolster our security cooperation and investments in the Gulf. But I think what's missing is a demonstration of U.S. leadership in the region, and particularly on Syria and Iraq and Yemen. As I mentioned, those are the areas that the Gulf countries I think are most concerned about in terms of what Iran has been doing and what it potentially could do going forward. And so the need for a greater dialogue and actual movement forward to address those problems from a political perspective, I think, is what the Gulf countries will be truly looking forward. Although I am sure that they will welcome, further investments in their security capabilities, which I'm happy to, speak about as well.
We'll do. And I wanted to ask you one more question on this. We talk about the Gulf as this monolithic, creature. Saudi Arabia's position is the position of all the other GCC states. Is that really the case, or has this agreement and some of the reactions caused any fissures inside the system itself?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. We tend to refer to the GCC as the GCC. There's the primary factor that's in play in the region right now is the Saudi-Iran kind of Cold War, if you will. That's happening in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. And so that's driving a lot of the instability and potential for escalation in the region. But you're absolutely right to point out that the Gulf reaction overall is what's somewhat varied. If you consider places like Bahrain or Oman, and even to a certain extent Kuwait, and even the dynamic between Dubai and Abu Dhabi is different. The smaller Gulf states have longstanding historical and economic ties to Iran. Oman actually played a key role in opening the dialogue with the United States and Iran that was quite useful. And then in the Emirates, although they, like Saudi Arabia, are quite strong on voicing their concerns privately about where Iran might be headed, there are significant economic ties between Dubai and Iran that I think somewhat affect the internal calculus of the Emiratis as well. So,
great, and we'll come back to you in a minute. Also, I want to now bring in our third panelist, David Makovsky. David is the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute and director of the Project on the Middle East Peace Process. He's written numerous books about the Middle East peace process, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and also a lot lately on Israel and Iran and that dynamic, and perhaps most importantly for me, David and I were comrades in arms during Secretary Kerry's previous attempts at negotiation before the Iran deal on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, when I really had an opportunity to get to know David. So David, it's really great to have you here today, and I thought I'd start by asking you a very simple question. The US and Israel have a special relationship and are as close as two countries can be in some ways, and yet here we are today. How did we get here? What has happened? What has gone wrong in the last few months?
Thanks for the easy ones, Elon. Well, first of all, it's a delight to be with you. I really enjoyed our time together, and it's an honor to be with panelists and to learn from them. So thank you for having me. Look, I think, the fundamental point is that, that from where Israel sits, this thing went way off track, and that the original objective was to eliminate the prospects for Iran to get a nuclear weapon. And what's happened is that has morphed subtly but profoundly into managing the Iranian nuclear program. We still say we don't want them to get a weapon, but by the choices, the policy choices we have made, it has led to a real parting of the ways. I mean, you could trace it to issues like zero enrichment or not. I mean, to get technical about it, but I think the overarching critique, I think, in Israel would be twofold. One is that while they would acknowledge for 15 years, and even Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that publicly when everyone said Iran would cheat because they cheated, according to the IAEA, for so long, he says, I think they might not cheat because the payoff at year 15 is so big that the caps on, which actually are lifted even before year 15 on centrifuge production, they will have industrial capacity for that, and that the stockpile that has been depleted, which is one of the big achievements of this deal, going from 10,000 kilo to 300, capping the number of centrifuges, I think the plutonium thing of taking out the core, filling it with cement, that blocks that pathway for a while, probably beyond 15 years for a variety of technical reasons, and they wouldn't contest that. Their critique is really twofold, which is at year 15, when, to put it in sports terms, being that I like sports, is like they're out of the penalty box. They're back on the ice with everybody else. There's no caps on their centrifuges. There's no caps on their stockpile. Who is going to stop this country from making that final dash to a bomb? And with all the words that the president says, they haven't heard an answer yet. And so I think that's one. And the second critique, which both of my colleagues have said really here, is their critique, which is the amount of money that will be available to their proxies by unlocking their frozen bank assets once they come into compliance with Vienna or JCPOA, maybe as soon as next June. $150 billion, I think is what the president has said. And let's say even a large majority goes to Iranian roads and clinics, it's still going to be a lot of money. I mean, the Iranian defense budget, I think I've seen numbers at 15 billion. I've seen the president say 30 billion. Most, I think, say 15. I think the Israeli defense budget is 8, but they get 3 billion from the United States, 11. But 150 billion, and even assuming the majority goes to the civilian infrastructure, it's just an order of magnitude that is mind-boggling there. And maybe in America, it's like, this is all far away. The Middle East is a mess anyway. But they don't see what is the answer on those two critiques. And no matter what else is said, they keep coming back to those two critiques. And when the president said, well, we can't solve all the problems at once. We can only solve one. We can solve the nuclear. We can't solve that. They would find that more convincing if the terrorism issue was somehow revenue neutral, I would say. But when you throw 150 billion with a B into the mix, and again, not all 150, but because, I think as, Suzanne said, I mean, it's not just the Rouhani wing is going to get a win, but you're going to have to give the IRGC, the deep state of Qasem Soleimani a win. So you know, and that is not including new money for new oil revenue, new business ventures. So it's, you know, that you'd say it's a lower end number. They just find they're going to be left with a Middle East on steroids, that this is a Faustian bargain that to defer a nuclear issue for 15 years, they have been left with a more empowered Iran to destabilize the region from day one, or day 9 months, let's say. And that, it's those two critiques that I think they feel they haven't heard an answer to.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm wondering, you know, you talk about they as the Israelis, but, you know, you have Prime Minister Netanyahu, you have opponents who are actually criticizing him now, not about the agreement, but about execution and U.S.-Israel relations. You have the security establishment, which has a bit of a different perspective, though similar on all this. Can you maybe try to break that down for us? Like,
Great.
What's going on?
Here's the thing. Lapid, who was Netanyahu's finance minister, usually to Netanyahu's left, is outflanking him from the right. He's saying, this is such a horrible deal that the Americans have done, and you're to blame because you have a poor relationship with Obama. Maybe you could have mitigated it somewhat if you had better relations. But it isn't a critique on the deal itself. You know, they're all echoing it. Herzog, the head of the Labor Party, has not yet joined the government, even though Netanyahu clearly wants to use this as you know, no crisis should go to waste and turn it into an opportunity to broaden his government. But he says, I hate this deal too, but I could do that from the opposition. I mean, there's been a lot of talk of even a joint op-ed piece between the two of them to show unity. The polls so far have been 70 to 80% against. The discordant vote, I think, is from more in the think tank world, from some of the experts, a guy like Eli Levita, who I think is probably one of the smartest I have encountered in terms of being creative and a problem solver. His piece was the good, the bad, and the ugly. And he'll say, look, at least say 15 years is something. And it is. And it would be wrong, you know, it would be churlish not to acknowledge that. So there's more of a recognition, I think, in that narrow world of the kind of the policy intellectuals that 15 years is something, and the Middle East is so turbulent and so is in such an upheaval that 15 years of something, and you know, the region just shouldn't blow up in the 16th year, but 15 years is already good. So I mean, they are more willing to acknowledge the good in the agreement, which Netanyahu is not willing to do, and I think for tactical reasons, because he's got his eye on the congressional vote. And it's the same reason why he, you know, maybe we'll talk about it, what a package could be for Israel, but his latest line is, if this was a good agreement, no one would have to even talk about a compensation package. And so it might be the first time in history of the U.S.-Israel relations that you have a prime minister saying, I don't want your money, I don't want your hardware, just leave me alone. And I think he's doing it because tactically he fears that anything that would somehow dilute the intensity of his objection, the moral clarity of his opposition, would somehow be used against him in that congressional vote. So you could say he's doubling down, and what if he loses that bet, which I think is a very fair question, but he doesn't want anything to muddy those waters.
But potentially, after the deal goes down in Congress, those options still
remain.
Right.
I think then you'll see the defense community assert itself more. But right now, you've got a prime minister who is in such a white-hot anger mode that nobody wants to, get in that way. So, but I agree that we're going to hear their voices more often. And I think, frankly, even from in the Netanyahu circles, what I'm picking up is, okay, it doesn't happen with this administration, it'll happen with the next administration. They don't feel there's a window here closing, because you could say that their leverage is best before the congressional vote, but that is certainly not the approach this prime minister is taking.
So let me ask a question to all three of you, actually. We've heard the lay down on what's going on with, in Iran, in the Gulf, and in Israel. The United States, at least the president, the people around him, and I at least personally, I would argue, has made the decision that this is in the U.S. interest. and has consulted with its P5+1 partners and come up with, I think, unanimity, at least amongst many of the world's great powers, that this is in the world's interest, whether one agrees with it or not. And even aside from all the proliferation benefits, though we do have these complications now in the region and these dynamics of what's going to happen in Iran, what do you recommend to the United States should do now in the region, and how should it approach this very complicated aftermath of the agreement in terms of moving forward, both in terms of our policy towards Iran, towards the Gulf, and towards Israel? So maybe I'll start with Suzanne and your take on this.
Look, I think the president is right. This is the best alternative that we have at this particular moment in time. It may not be the best possible deal that could have been negotiated, but given the other options that we have available to us today, we have to go all in on the deal. We have to ensure that it gets through the Congress, which I think it will. And then I think we have to demonstrate that we're both testing the possibilities with Iran, despite the skepticism about some sort of kind of breakthrough change in the character of the regime or the approach of the Islamic Republic at home or abroad. But I also think we have to demonstrate that we're capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time, that we're capable of implementing this accord to its utmost, but that implementing this accord will not tie our hands behind our back in addressing the range of other concerns that we have about Iranian behavior in the region and Iranian behavior at home, which is, I think, as big a concern in the aftermath of this deal for Iranians as the troublemaking around the region is for its neighbors.
Can you give maybe like an example or two of what that would actually look like? Or?
Well, I think one of the concerns that I mentioned at the outset is that the obligations of the deal, the way the deal is structured and written, we're going to have a lot of difficulty in sort of imposing the ultimate penalty for concerns about breaches of the deal, because it will appear to be, it will wreck the deal if we call the Iranians and try to move to a snapback scenario. The Iranians are then no longer under their obligations to continue to enforce the restraints on their nuclear program. So I think there's going to be a lot of trepidation about doing that. And what the administration has said all along is that, yes, we have a range of alternatives. The unfortunately described Chinese menu of sanctions that remain on the books that we'll be able to continue to enforce and to redesignate particular Iranian institutions. I think the administration is going to need to show that it's capable of taking those sort of non-deal wrecking actions on the implementation of the deal, but it's also got to demonstrate that those authorities that remain on the books, whether it's Executive Order 13224 that targets terrorist financing and activity, that we're prepared to designate Iranian entities and prepared to go after Tehran for its continued role around the region. So I think we have a lot of ability to create pain for the Iranian state as a result of its actions. I'm just not convinced in the aftermath of this deal we're prepared to take those actions.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things I was talking actually with my colleague Liz Rosenberg about earlier. Here on the next panels, in some ways, there is this default when you're dealing with countering Iranian terrorism, where we default to sanctions because they're the easiest tool and they're the least risky tool, as opposed to some of the things the intelligence community can do or the Department of Defense can do. But it might, ironically or sort of paradoxically, in this case, sanctions for terrorism might risk the agreement, whereas more aggressive action elsewhere might actually list the agreement less.
Might risk the agreement less, but it might create an escalatory spiral with the Iranians in the region that would be equally problematic. I don't think there are going to be any simple solutions, but I think that, as you suggest, and I know you have some interesting and I think very valuable ideas for how the administration can address this outside of sanctions. We have to be prepared to demonstrate to Tehran that this deal is not going to leave us on the defensive with respect to the range of other concerns.
Melissa, maybe we can have you discuss so how we try to fix things with the GCC here, but also more broadly other recommendations you have for the Obama administration going forward in the region.
Great, thanks. The inertia of the administration is going to inevitably lead it to make investments in security cooperation, offer additional security assurances through multilateral exercises, building strike capabilities, maritime security, missile defense, and all of that is good to do. But as I mentioned earlier, the real gap here is at the political level and addressing some of the fundamental challenges in the region. In addition, we have seen a growing propensity in the Gulf to take independent action to address some of their security concerns as they perceive an absence of U.S. leadership on Yemen and, in Syria and Iraq. And so very fundamentally, there needs to be a greater push for a multilateral dialogue to discuss what outcomes are we actually trying to achieve together with our partners in the region to address Yemen, to address Iraq and Syria, the Islamic State, and the potential for Iran to increase its support to proxies and destabilizing activities in the region. What outcomes are we trying to achieve? What objectives do we need to aim for to get there? And then have a discussion about the capabilities that we need to build at the military level in support of that strategy. I think that should be the main focus of the administration going forward. And as a part of that, I would hope to see a new strategy that seeks to deter and contain Iranian activities in the region, while at the same time building confidence with our Gulf partners to allow for the possibilities to test whether Iran can be a more constructive player in the region. I think there's a great deal of skepticism on our side, as well as particularly in the Gulf and with Israel, that's possible. But the trick in creating a deterrence and containment strategy is that how do you prevent escalation, prevent Iranian greater aggression and investments in their proxies, but at the same time searching for possible ways, whether it's in the tactical maritime domain, in other areas, to test for possible avenues of, I wouldn't say cooperation, but confidence-building measures with the Iranians.
Sure, and one other question, Melissa. We talk a lot, and I did gear this question towards what the United States should do, but the Gulf has something to do here too, obviously.
Yes.
Their perspective, is they do seem to, their prescription of the problem is everything that ails us is coming out of Iran, which I think a lot of, at least in the U.S. side, folks would question. I wonder if you can sort of see what do the Gulf states need to do to step up and take on their part of this equation?
Right. I think it gets to a more sensitive, point of engagement with the Gulf countries, and that's their own internal security vulnerabilities that Iran is able to exploit with its destabilizing tactics and through its proxies. And so, the United States doesn't have a great track record on engaging regimes in the region to address these types of governance, human rights issues, but I think we need to remain firm on that and press for greater action on the part of the Gulf countries, pointing out the fact that those are vulnerabilities that Iran is able to exploit, and if that is what they are really concerned about, is Iran's kind of political subversion and asymmetric capability, then perhaps they need to shore up their internal security vulnerabilities by addressing some of the governance concerns.
Sure. Now David, in terms of how we try to put Humpty Dumpty back together again with the Israelis right now, what would you recommend for both President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu in terms of things that they can do going forward? Or is this basically an issue of waiting out the next year and a half, and these two guys are never going to be able to really come together?
Look, there's the personal dimension, which, there's never going to be a romance here between the two, and you'll just have to stabilize whatever possible. But I think the overarching critique, which again, I think my colleagues and I are saying similar ideas, is how do you, really instill a sense of deterrence that would not renegotiate this deal, but work at the edges, but that could have an impact because the Israeli critique is similar, than others. The regionalists are very focused on the Iranian proxies to destabilize through asymmetric warfare, but it seems to me that the kind of thread that threads through all these critiques is how do you reinforce deterrence? If Israel's critique is, what about year 15? Who's going to stop these guys from making a dash? I was part of this bipartisan policy group that came out with recommendations before there was a deal. We have not taken a position on the deal itself. We're looking for more clarifications at this point, but I think that the key is, are we in the U.S. Congress going to be able to say in year 15, I mean, this president will be long gone, but if you do break out, you know, the U.S. will not just have all options on the table, but will use force. It's clearly a last resort. Nobody wants that. The whole idea of doing this deal is to avoid war in many ways, but at the same time, you know, we have certain red lines with our allies, and I think that would certainly cool the waters on that. But I think it's not just about that. If it's on the regional piece that I spoke about before, you know, and I would reinforce something Suzanne said. Are we going to redesignate? Some of these guys are multiply listed for non-proliferation, for proliferation and terrorism and human rights. Are we going to do that? And on the issue of like consequences of penalties, yes, if you read the agreement, there's the ultimate consequence, which is the whole deal comes apart, which, you know, if you want this deal to pass, you obviously don't want that. But what are the penalties lower down for smaller violations? They said they're going to enrich at 3.67, but they enrich at 7% or something. What are we going to do? I think we should use the time between now and the next 60 days and work with our European allies, with Britain, with France, with Germany. If you read the snapback, together we're 4, and we're a majority in the snapback committee. And do we have a common interpretation of what the agreement is and in terms of what the penalties are? What I'm trying to say is I don't believe that you could renegotiate this deal, whatever the critiques are. The question is, can you compensate for them by working the edges, by using deterrence by common interpretation with our European allies, by dealing with redesignations. The Israelis will think that they're kind of left helpless there. The clear thing they've been focused on is the MOP, which is the Massive Ordnance Penetrator. They don't have an airplane to get there. It's only the B-52 and the B-2. You don't deliver it tomorrow, but you say before year 15. You'll have year 8 or whatever it is to train on that so that you're not defenseless in year 15. And after year 15, you know, we make our statement clear now. So the thread, I think the common denominator thread in all this is reassuring allies is how are we going to stop the Iranian kind of ability to use this agreement to become emboldened as a power in the Middle East. And I think we've got to think along, you know, 10 or 15 categories where we could use deterrence. And I think it's not about gutting the agreement for those who support it. And I'm not coming out endorsing it or coming out against it. But I'm saying that we should be creative in how do we work with our allies at the edges here to do what I think every single one of us are saying, that this will embolden Iran, and how do we deal with that to offset that prospect?
Sure, and for the Israelis, I mean, having that kind of conversation would require coming back in now, obviously. You think, I mean, would you recommend that to the Prime Minister?
Look, I clearly, I mean, I think Yossi Cohen led a delegation to see Susan Rice, Yossi Cohen being Netanyahu's national security advisor. I tend to think what's invariably going to happen, because in the ideal world, I would say, yes, come to the table tomorrow. But knowing where the dynamic is, I tend to think that the dust is going to have to settle on the congressional votes for that to happen. I mean, Aaron Miller's phrase is, you know, this relationship is too big to fail. I just think there's too much at stake. And as you pointed out in your opening remarks, there is a special relationship here. It's bigger than any, you know, relationship between two leaders. Like I said, no romance there, but I do think there's so much at stake that there needs to be a real strategic dialogue between these two countries and look at all the different dimensions and where deterrence can be reinforced. And I would certainly say we in the U.S. should do it with our friends in the Gulf and with our European allies as well. So I don't mean it in a mutually exclusive way by any sense. I think it's the U.S.-Arab relationship, the U.S.-European relationship. We should work this at every single level possible.
Great. Well, thank you. I think with that, we'll open it up for questions. Right here. Yep, gentleman with the I think we got microphones coming. Oh, no, it was the. There we go.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a wonderful panel. My name is Farzan Sabet. I'm a visiting fellow at Georgetown University. So my question is to Dr. Maloney, but also open to the floor. President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif have been pushing what they call a world against violent extremism agenda, which seeks to create kind of at least in appearance, a cooperative middle ground on a range of regional conflicts. So from the Iranian perspective, this would probably involve acknowledging Iranian interests in places like Western Syria and Iraq. But the dynamic in the region appears to be kind of moving towards confronting what is seen as a resurgent post-deal Iran. So my question is, how serious versus purely rhetorical do you think President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif kind of world against violence extremism agenda is? And do the regional dynamics really allow for such an initiative to create a regional level detente on issues like ending the civil war in Syria and Yemen and fighting common threats in Iraq? Thank you.
The wave, that was President Rouhani's follow-up UN Security Council speech last year. It didn't go over quite as well as his first one did, but maybe it will take off this year. Look, I believe that Rouhani represents this kind of centrist faction within the regime, and that faction, and I believe it has wide consensus, is not bent on sort of regional troublemaking or simple destruction of the order within the broader Middle East. There is a consensus that Iran's interests are best served by a good offense in the case of dealing with ISIS and in the preservation of Bashar Assad's regime in Syria, but also that Iran's fundamental security is predicated on greater prosperity and engagement with Europe in particular, not a turn toward the East, but a return to the West. And those are going to be factors that I think shape a willingness to at least test the possibilities of some kind of greater engagement with the United States where it suits Iran's interests, not in respect to sort of conceding some of these fundamental interests like the preservation of Assad. I think that Iran can be managed in part because it is not a purely destructive, evil regime, but one that has some pragmatic constraints within it. But obviously, as you suggest, there is a cycle of escalation within the region. There is I think, a real new era in Saudi foreign policy, which is not entirely or even wholly positive, gauged not just from the Iranian perspective, but from the American perspective as well. I don't know that we can entirely predict what a 29-year-old defense minister who has a fairly weak king and father may do next. So I do recognize that there are going to be factors that can drive this situation, irrespective of the preferences of Washington or Tehran, into a more dangerous set of circumstances. And I think, as both of my fellow panelists have suggested, the major priority has to be now in working all of these relationships in a way that addresses both the worst possibilities of what Iran might do, but also how our allies might respond in ways that are problematic.
Either of you want to weigh in on that, or should we just move on? Right here, actually, let's go. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, my name is Samira. I'm from the Center for the National Interest. My first question is geared mainly towards Dr. Maloney, but can go to anyone in the panel. You mentioned that the deal doesn't signify a political shift in Iran, but I was wondering if we look beyond the political shift and look more into the economic incentives for Iran. If Iran is now open to regional economics and to work more closely with the different countries, if, for example, it builds oil pipelines and stuff throughout the region, do you think that would incentivize Iran to have a more responsible approach to the Middle East and have less incentive to destabilize the region and more incentive to work closely because it has economic responsibilities? And then moving on to the regional implications, or continuing to the regional implications, if we've exhausted our political leverage in curbing Iran's foreign policy. Do you think now that we have the opportunity to work with business and investment in Iran, if we're able to incentivize Iran to change its foreign policy, not due to diplomacy and stuff like that, but due to actual economic incentives? With the deal, the first people that are going to invest in Iran will be Russia, China, Asia, the rest of the Middle East, but they don't have the same technical expertise and capacity that America does. So do you think that would incentivize Iran to work more closely with America?
Sure, I'll give it to Suzanne, though I will also mention that there's a whole second panel that's going to focus precisely on this question, on the economy.
Yeah, I know that the next set of speakers are going to focus on this quite a bit, but I do think it's worth mentioning. And I avoided it in my opening remarks just knowing that we had another panel on this. But you know, if you look at the history of Iran, I think you find a very uncertain relationship between economic openings, economic prosperity, and either domestic political restraint or regional restraint. So for example, you know, the periods of greatest progress in terms of Iran's evolution in a positive fashion, both at home and abroad, did not occur during times of economic largesse. And we have not seen in the past that economic openings, for example, after the war and even continuing and intensifying during the Khatami period, actually helped those forces who were trying to liberalize Iran, at least with respect to its foreign policy or its domestic politics. So I actually don't see any short-term possibility that the kind of reopening of trade and the return to Iran of major international companies, many of whom have been there in the past, is likely to bring about, at least in the short term, the kind of positive political change that certainly many Iranians hope for. I think, you know, the near-term benefits are primarily or disproportionately going to accrue to those with access to the benefits of power within Iran, which tends to be either those closest to the regime and or aspects of the Revolutionary Guard and the security forces. And so those are going to be the players that are least interested in seeing genuine liberalization, transparency, and accountability within the system. In the long term, absolutely. You know, I don't think that Iran is China. It's not an economic player large enough to bend the forces of the market to its will. And so if you look in 30, 40, 50 years in Iran without international trade versus in Iran fully reintegrated in the international trade and financial systems, the latter will be far more liberalized than the former. But in the relevant period of time for this deal, for this administration, and for the way that people in policy positions think, business isn't really a panacea to the problems of Iranian extremism, either at home or abroad.
A question in the back, there in the middle.
Thank you. My question to Dr. Melissa, you mentioned the concern of Arab states in Yemen and Syria, and President Obama said that the next administration will be focused on counter ISIS in the Middle East. So what's your assessment for the American or coalition approach to counter ISIS next year? Just focus on at the end of this administration. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think that you know, there's been a lot of emphasis on the airstrike dimension of the coalition efforts, and you know, I think the fact that Arab partners have stepped up to be a part of that coalition, particularly in the early days, and you know, I think the United States is seeking to ensure that those partners can be resupplied in order to continue to be strong members of the coalition. I think, you know, has built some good momentum for the future of what multilateral security cooperation could look like in the region, and then specifically to address the threat of the Islamic State, which is a long-term generational challenge for the region. So this is a good development, but it is exclusively just focused on the airstrike. campaign without the ground component. And there's been a lot of public debate and commentary, about the paucity of the Syria Train Equip program. Only 60 fighters that have made it through the training program thus far, although I will note, knowing from colleagues that work these issues inside of government, that the funding and authorities to be in that program only were authorized earlier this year. So the program has been, in fact, talked about for a couple of years, or year and a half, but has in actuality only been up and running for a few months. So hopefully more to come on that. And then on the Iraqi side, this is not a new observation, but the importance of bringing in the Sunni tribes, and along the lines of what was attempted in 2008, I think is a critical piece that the United States and the Iraqis and the greater region are working towards, but far more work to be done there. The bottom line is that in the absence of a ground campaign to complement the air campaign, we're just not going to make inroads to contain and push back the Islamic State. And that's just the military piece. There is, of course, the political dimension, which I referred to earlier in the conversation, that there just needs to be a more robust multilateral effort on the part of the regional Arab partners, European allies, the United States, to push forward on political solutions for both Iraq and Syria. We can't afford to let the the Syria side slide any more than it already has. Understandably, the focus has been on securing the Iran nuclear deal, but perhaps Iran and Russia have a role to play in pressuring Assad to come to the negotiating table.
Another question? Let's go over here.
Hi, my name is Rami Hassan. You mentioned allaying the fears of our allies. Are we actually able to do that? I know you mentioned the Israelis, because they just never seem to be satisfied unless we're on a war footing with Iran. And do you think that's possible? Because at what point do we stop apologizing for making peace?
I don't think that's they would accept your characterization at all. I think they were hoping that the U.S. in their view would try to eliminate the nuclear threat, really block the pathways, not just delay for 15 years in that case. So they think, the Prime Minister says it paves the way for them to have a nuclear bomb. I think it's a nuanced picture, like I said, on the plutonium. I think it really is blocked. I think for 15 years it takes down the stockpile of uranium. I think it puts a cap on the centrifuges. I think those are real achievements. But if you lived over there, you would see it maybe differently, that it doesn't block the way the president claims it does, and that there's going to be a huge cash infusion to the allies that they're going to suffer the brunt of when they have fought, 3 wars with Hamas in 6 years. They fought Hezbollah. Nasrallah says he's got 100,000 rockets. This is all before any infusion. So, I don't think they would accept the way you characterized it at all. But I didn't say that the answer, therefore, is to scuttle the deal. I think it could be that for those who think that this deal should be kept, that there's ways to work the edges of it. And I tried to give some practical recommendations, but it's not if you're against peace or something like that. And I don't think the answers are wars. I mean, I think we should give this thing a chance. To the extent that this deal will have an impact, will people in Iran look at the region differently as a result of globalization? Certainly people hope so. But they're also aware that Iran isn't a democracy, that in 2009, 2 million people came to the streets, and the leadership crushed them. So the majority might want a different future, because of globalization and economic incentives and all those nice things. But they, you know, the people who fire the shots tend to call the shots over there, and therefore maybe it'll work, and maybe it's worth giving it a shot. But you know, I think there are limitations, and the question is, can you work the edges to minimize those risks?
So we have just a couple minutes left, so what I'm going to do is take a couple of remaining questions and maybe do one last round through the group and call it a. So, Laura.
Thank you all for doing this. I'm Laura Rosen from Al Monitor. David, this sounds more naive than I think it is. The German economics minister has been in Iran, and as soon as he landed, he told the press that Iran can't enjoy full economic reintegration with Europe and Germany without stopping threatening Israel's existence. And the next day, the MFA spokeswoman for Iran, you know, said, "Well, we're not going to start relations with Israel." But it was just interesting at all that it was being covered in the Iranian press. Could there be some indirect mediation or where Israel's bare minimum from Iran could be communicated, and Iran, for pragmatic reasons, not ideological reasons, might be persuaded to follow those red lines?
Let me take a couple more questions, then we'll do one quick round. So I think that was definitely going to David and others. Right over here.
Hi, I'm Cheryl from the Singapore Embassy. I have just two quick questions. One, we heard from John Wolfstall that it takes about $900 billion to bring the Iranian economy back on track, and that we expect about $100 billion on sanctions relief, and it will probably take some time for the economy to get kick-started. My question is there a kind of mismatch in expectations between what the Iranian people expect and what the Americans and European negotiators expect to happen, and is this potentially destabilizing for the deal? And my second question is,
I'm sorry, can we do just one question because we're so tight on time? I'll take one more question from the audience. Right in the very back, standing up, gentlemen.
Hi, I'm Dan Harris with the Asia Group. Thank you very much for having this discussion. I wanted to ask what effect, if any, you think that this agreement might have on the upcoming elections to the Iranian Majlis and the Assembly of Experts. I think that is something that we'd all like to hear.
Well, maybe we can start with Suzanne and go down the line. That last one sounded like it was right in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, and I'm going to take the liberty of saying a word on Laura's question, even though I know it was meant for David and for Melissa. In terms of the Majlis elections, look, Iran has so many ways to influence the outcome of elections. It doesn't need to do a deal to get a certain election outcome. And I think, like most countries, domestic elections tend to be influenced, particularly within the parliament, which has a kind of very long history in Iran. And a lot of local politics engaged are not influenced so much by broad international threats or opportunities as they are by local and domestic priorities in politics. So, you know, I'm sure that it will be watched closely. It has always served as a kind of bellwether of political trends within Iran. When we saw the rise of neoconservatives in Iran, we saw it first in city councils and then in the parliament. So I think we'll all be watching to see what happens, but I don't know that the deal itself will influence it. A mismatch of expectations, you know, that will be very much up to the Iranian government. And I think Rouhani, in fact, has a great technical team on the economic side, and they're going to work very hard to avoid some of the mistakes of the past in terms of managing this large influx. That's aside from the sort of questions about where does it flow or how much does it flow to the Revolutionary Guard or terrorist proxies. The Iranians have perhaps a more prosaic concern, inflation and the overheating of the economy. So it is going to be a real challenge to manage this shift, both the kind of return of the international financial system and companies, but also the massive amount of money that's going to come in first through the release of the assets that have been held abroad, and then eventually through trade and investment. So it's a challenge. I don't know that popular expectations are likely to be disappointed, if only because Iranians are so used to their government not living up to the expectations of economic progress. And just a word on the Germans and the Israeli question. The Germans are not likely to serve as a really useful prod, despite whatever rhetoric might have been used on the visit. The Germans historically were one of Iran's largest trade partners and are likely to be the biggest beneficiaries on the European side, although the French are going to give them a run for their money from the reopening. And in effect, I think the bigger concern is, are they going to be the weak link within the Joint Commission and the implementation of the deal? The question of, can Iran be convinced to change its approach to Israel through some kind of pragmatism about retaining this new relationship with the world? The simple reality is that no one in Iran, and certainly no one else in the international community, believes there's even the remotest possibility of the reconstitution of the sanctions that we've seen over the course of the past 5 years on the basis of Iran's support for terrorism, ever. Short of some sort of extraordinary provocation. And so without that kind of an incentive to change posture, I'm skeptical.
And Melissa and Dave, can I ask you guys to keep it very brief since
Yep.
we're basically out of time?
Just in brief, pivoting off of the expectations and perceptions of the Iranians, receiving this economic windfall with the lifting of sanctions. Interesting to see how that may play out in the Gulf, because with the heightened expectations and with this growing propensity for independent action, the 29-year-old defense minister in Saudi, will the Saudis and other Gulf partners potentially make somewhat rash decisions that are not entirely consistent with U.S. interests? I think we've seen this playing out in Yemen. Could it happen in other areas as they expect that the Iranians may up their game asymmetrically? I think is an area to watch.
Look, to Laura Rosen's question, whether the Germans are the right, messengers for that, even though I should say they have been kind of one of Israel's best friends in Europe. And I'm not saying it's not heartfelt, but Suzanne gave the other side of the ledger in terms of their economic activity. I think others undoubtedly will make the same point, but it's, and in this world where there's track 2 messages and everyone's talking to everybody in a certain level, if Iran had that interest, I have no doubt that the Israelis would want to improve those relations. But I think you could ask the question, once Iran has gotten this deal and got close to whatever it wanted without paying any price in that coinage, what incentive does Iran have for doing that, after the deal? So if there's a will, there's a way. I just don't see the incentive for their will. The Ayatollah, I think, tweets out every couple months, here are the 9 ways to eliminate Israel. And now is going to get a nuclear arsenal within 15 years. So there's a question here. And, some people say the forces of globalization are stronger than anything. And if so, that will be transformational. This will be transformational on so many levels in terms of relations, dynamics within the Middle East. But whether it'll be transformational in that sense, I think certainly is yet to be seen.
Well, I'd like to just thank our panelists. I thought it was a really rich and interesting discussion. And now we're going to be handing it over to Zach Goldman and for a discussion on the economics of the Iran deal. But just I want to say thank you again to Suzanne and Melissa and David.
Thank you.
Senior Fellow at CNAS. It's a real pleasure to be here with friends old and new to discuss the economic and sanctions dimensions of the Iran deal as a complement to the discussions we had earlier this morning. So I will briefly introduce the rest of the panel. We've got Colin McGuinness, who's the Senior Democrat Policy Director on the Senate Banking Committee, Liz Rosenberg, Director of the Energy Economics and Security Program at CNAS, Caroline Herndl, who's the head of the Middle East team at the British Embassy in Washington, and Sean Thornton, formerly Chief Counsel at the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, and currently Chief Legal Advisor to Group Financial Security at BNP Paribas. So thank you all for coming. So I will very, very briefly, in the beginning of the discussion, just lay out the framework for sanctions relief that was described in the agreement reached last week, and then turn to our panelists for a discussion. So broadly, the agreement does sort of two things. It establishes two phases for relief. One on implementation day, which will, as Mr. Wolfstall said this morning, probably occur sometime early next year. And the second phase is transition day, which is 8 years from 90 days from yesterday. So roughly 8 years from now, assuming full compliance with the deal. And on implementation day, the United States will waive large portions of its secondary sanctions on Iran, will remove from its specially designated national list and other sanctions lists a large number of Iranian persons and entities. And the EU will do the same. It will waive or relax many of its legal authorities and remove many people from its sanctions list. 8 years from now, the U.S. will terminate many of its legal authorities, and both, as will the EU, and both the EU and the U.S. will remove a further tranche of persons and entities from its sanctions list. And I think Caroline will help us clarify in a little bit exactly who will be removed and with whom transactions will be permitted and not. A few key points about both stages of relief. So both stages of relief apply only to nuclear-related sanctions. So sanctions applied against Iran for a wide range of other concerning behavior, counterterrorism, human rights abuses, provision of support to the regime in Syria, all of those will remain in place, with a few exceptions, most importantly for pistachios, caviar, and carpets. The restrictions that apply to U.S. persons will also remain in place. So by and large, unless activity is licensed by the government, American companies and businesses will not be able to engage in Iran. And so what emerges from this is a very, very complicated sanctions landscape with important strategic implications for the longevity and the viability of a deal. And so that's what I think we'll discuss this morning. And so I'll do so by turning first to Liz. Liz, you've written a fantastic piece in Foreign Affairs last week that kind of outlined some of these strategic risks and dynamics. So talk a little bit, if you can, about the kinds of risks that remain in Iran and the kinds of factors that will determine whether or not Iran receives the benefits that are contemplated in the JCPOA.
Sure. Thanks, Zach, and for the introduction. And on behalf of CNAS, because I wear that hat, I'm glad you're all here with us today. So the risks that still remain for companies or entities that would invest in Iran, there are a number of them. And just because this deal leans forward on an agreement and a kind of an opening for Iran commercially and diplomatically in the world, there's still quite a number of causes for reluctance, commercial reluctance on the part of those who would re-enter Iran. And as you just alluded to, that has a strategic significance. If Iran doesn't feel the benefit of this deal, it will feel as though the P5+1 is not making good on its side, which is concerning then for longevity of the deal. So why the reluctance? There are a couple of main categories here. One is the concern about whether the deal will hold. Whether Iran will cheat and there will be a reimposition of sanctions, in which case one's business investments there could fall apart and possibly be tied up in those sanctions. And that has reputational harm and, of course, commercial harm. Also, will spoilers, for example, there's a lot of attention on the U.S. Congress, will other outside actors come and try and undermine the deal in some way, which would then again potentially see foreign investors get tied up in reputational or commercial harm. Also, concerns about the business climate. So Iran may have a good deal of work to do to improve financial systems integrity. They've received a pretty poor grade by the international technical standard setting body, the Financial Action Task Force, on a number of those scores. And there's been a concerning history of corruption, particularly associated with the Ahmadinejad era, that they'll need to move beyond in order to give foreign investors the confidence to move in there. Also, of course, even in this rosy scenario for nuclear diplomacy, there's still a lot of sanctions that will remain on Iran. In the EU, in the United States, and at the UN too, past implementation day, of course, those have to do with areas not germane to this agreement, excuse me, such as human rights, regional destabilization. So those remain in place, and also the restrictions that bar U.S. companies from being involved creates a web surrounding the potential business involvement in Iran that every foreign company must navigate to try and figure out how to make its inroad there. And finally, I would just flag another big concern or reason for reluctance for foreign investors is how U.S. law enforcement will look at this deal and activity in commercial activity in Iran. So we have strong signals from policymakers about how they would like to see the future engagement with Iran going forward, but we don't have press releases from the Department of Justice or the New York Department of Financial Services indicating how they plan to look upon accidental or intentional violations of sanctions going forward. So that's another area of great concern for big banks and companies who've seen a record of very expensive, reputationally damaging big bank settlement cases in the last several years. As to why it's important that this occur, we've said of course, Iran needs to see the benefit of its bargain in order to move forward. And beyond that, I think there's good strategic reason for the P5+1 and indeed the entire international community to want to see Iran be able to develop commercially, economically, improve financial system transparency, which may be a byproduct of dollar diplomacy, if you will. And also, I will just note and close that it may give the United States and the EU greater economic leverage later with Iran to see greater economic integration between these economies, which is a kind of, if you are a hawk or a skeptic, useful insurance policy on future policy down the road with Iran.
So let's talk just briefly, and then Colin, I'd like to pick up on Liz's allusion to the congressional review period, but let's talk briefly about one specific area, and that is the energy sector. Yeah. So what is Iran likely to seek, and what is it likely to obtain in terms of relationships with the global, the sort of energy giants, given that these are companies that are often used to dealing with risky, dicey, difficult parts of the world?
So the reason why it's useful to talk about energy companies in particular, of course, is because Iran has world-class oil and gas reserves. It's an incredibly strategic commodity for its economy, for its revenue base, and indeed for the kind of economic reform it would like to support. It needs this, it needs that revenue, it needs an expansion of production in the oil and gas sector. And in order to really take it to the next level and regain certainly the kind of, well, it may be able to regain production levels independently that it was at right before those most punishing sanctions were imposed in late 2011, 2012. But to really take it to the next level and add another million barrels or more to that, it needs the kind of technical assistance and support and partnership that you get from partnering with a sophisticated international oil company that has the experience and expertise on use of technology, on process management, supply chain management. And you've seen in the past when it has partnered with some of those last companies standing, Chinese companies, for example, in Iran under these sanctions, it has not been able to ramp up independently its oil and gas production, partly because of the sanctions, of course, and also because of technical challenges that these companies have. That's one of the reasons why Iran would like to partner with European companies in particular, Western companies more broadly. They have relationships with European companies, more recent than American companies, of course, and And in this history, there's a lot of knowledge that's already existing knowledge about reservoirs and techniques suitable for specific plays, if you will. So whether they are able to entice those companies in, I think there's a lot of interest on all sides, but that depends on the kind of contract provisions that they lay out, and that's still certainly a work in progress. Also, those foreign companies will be careful not to hit go before implementation day for the reasons that we were just discussing about reluctance to harm one's reputation or violate sanctions in this environment.
Great, thanks. That's fantastic and very, very interesting set of dynamics, Liz. So before we hit go on implementation day, we have to hit adoption day. And Colin, I wonder if you could illuminate for us the administration transmitted on Sunday to Congress the deal for the statutorily mandated review period. So talk a little bit for us about what that review period is likely to look like. What is Congress or the Senate specifically likely to focus on? And what might the dynamic between the administration and Congress look like over the next 2 months?
Well, thanks, Zach, and thanks for having me. It's a delight to be here. I've learned a lot already. I think that it's important to emphasize that we're at a very early stage, that the documents were formally conveyed to Congress only on Sunday, and that there is this 60-day review period. Secretary Moniz, Secretary Kerry, Secretary Lew, and others are coming before Congress for an all-senators briefing and an all-House members briefing this week. And the National Security Committees that deal with these issues, banking, foreign relations, armed services, intelligence, and the like, will all be holding a series of hearings over the course of the next few weeks, and then perhaps in September in anticipation of a vote. But I think it's important to recognize that, ironically, much of the focus so far is on a set of issues outside of the scope of the agreement. And David has alluded to this, Suzanne did, John talked about it at some length at the outset. I think it's important to keep in mind that the focus of the agreement and its goal was to ensure that Iran could not develop a nuclear weapon. And that is also the focus of the very tough and comprehensive sanctions regime that Congress and the Obama administration have put in place over the course of the last 7 or 8 years. That people sometimes, given all the rhetoric around the deal and the regional security implications of the deal, forget that sanctions are not an end in themselves. They are a means to an end, and that end was to bring the Iranians to the table and to force them to negotiate an agreement like the one that has been negotiated thus far. I think Congress's focus will be very broad and hopefully very deep, and it will be the full gamut of issues that John talked about that are contemplated by the agreement. And they include the enrichment limitations, the enrichment R&D, the stockpile limitations, the changes to the Iraq reactor, the transparency and verification pieces of the agreement, including through the entire fuel cycle. I think it's very important that people assess and make kind of prudential judgments about in some ways, the genius of the fuel cycle limitations. And they've been alluded to obliquely earlier, but I think it's important to recognize that the purpose of having a monitoring and verification scheme that covers the whole fuel cycle is that it not only prevents Iran from taking untoward steps at their declared sites and within the mines and the mills and the uranium processing facilities and all the rest, all of which we have eyes on, but it is also designed to prevent a covert or a sneak out kind of an approach on Iran's behalf. Because if you know all of the inputs into that process and can monitor it all the way along, you can also then make judgments if there are discrepancies in terms of the outputs. And that's an important piece of the process that we haven't talked about yet. I think Congress will also want to look at the relationship between that fuel cycle monitoring process and the conversion from a procurement ban to a procurement channel. And people have talked a little bit about the implications of that, but that coupled with the fuel cycle piece is very important. I think the sanctions relief piece, its sequencing and phasing, and the obligations of Iran to comply with the whole set of obligations over the course of the next, whatever it is, 6 to 12 months is going to be very important. I think the ballistic missile and the conventional arms embargo, which has already been a focus of some critics, will be an important focus of congressional hearings and the like. And the dispute resolution mechanism that people have already talked about a little bit. All of those will be a focus of Congress's assessment. But I do think members will also look at the degree to which, and this has also been alluded to by earlier panels, the degree to which there's a willingness on the part of the administration to embed the agreement in a broader regional security strategy which deters Iran from the kind of malign support for terrorism, human rights abuse, and the like. And there are all kinds of legal authorities that the administration has, notwithstanding the relief that they provide in the context of the deal, to do that.
Interesting. Just talk a little bit about what the legislative options for Congress might be at the end of the review period. So it can vote all kinds of different resolutions. Maybe just explain a little bit what each of those options might look like.
So the Congressional Review Act, developed by Senator Cardin and Senator Corker, provides for basically explicitly two options in terms of resolutions. A resolution of approval or a resolution of disapproval within the 60-day review period. A third option, which doesn't require a resolution, is that Congress holds hearings, maybe adopts hortatory resolutions or other kind of side legislation, but doesn't act on a resolution with respect to the agreement itself. I think those are the three most likely options. Depending on how that plays out and whether Congress rejects the deal or not, and then presumably the president vetoes a resolution of disapproval, and the debate rages about whether he can persuade members not to override the veto, then there are also kind of ancillary steps that deal opponents might take subsequent to that. They could include new sanctions legislation, which presumably in that circumstance would also be vetoed. They could include appropriations limitations. There are a host of other possibilities, I think, that opponents might have going forward.
Great. Thank you. Carolyn, I want to turn to you, and I'm going to ask two questions, although I'll do it one at a time. One is to just talk a little bit about what the EU landscape is likely to look like. So we've all, or several of us, have sort of identified the fact that sanctions on U.S. companies are, for now at least, in place. And Colin, we can return to how persistent that restriction might be if there is a sustained period of compliance with the agreement. But EU companies, sometime early next year, are likely to be able to resume commercial ties with Iran. So if you could talk a little bit about how they're likely to assess some of the risks that Liz identified, and what the approach of various EU governments, obviously the British government in particular, is likely to be in terms of encouraging businesses to engage with Iran so that it receives the benefits of its bargain and adheres to the terms of the agreement, or instead highlights some of the risks related to support for counterterrorism, anti-money laundering concerns, and the like.
Sure. And first off, thank you for having me as well. It's really great to be here. In terms of the appetite, the business climate in Europe, I think I'd describe it as sort of cautious interest, and it very much varies from sector to sector. There are interests among businesses that have, in fairly recent past, done business with Iran. Obviously, we haven't got quite the same history of trade embargoes in Europe as there is here in the US. So there are businesses and companies that have an interest in going back into Iran or establishing new commercial ties with Iran. I think it's quite important to look very carefully, though, at the financial sector. The banks are some of those that have been hit hardest by fines, including when they have been deemed to contravene US secondary sanctions. So that sector in particular, I think, is extremely cautious across Europe, but obviously for us, particularly in the UK, about what is going to be possible in terms of, and what is going to be permissible under the new sanctions regime as it's adjusted as part of this deal. Before I sort of skip on to the next part of your question in terms of what the UK is doing to work with businesses, I think it's worth just highlighting again a couple of the comments that have been made by Liz and Colin and others throughout the morning, that this was a deal made by two sides, and the monitoring and verification processes that have been set out, the really stringent transparency mechanisms are there so we can make sure with absolute clarity that Iran is keeping to its side of the bargain. But as Liz said, Iran will be looking to us to do the same. And the reason this is important is that there are lots of people, lots of bodies in Iran that will be looking to cry foul and claim that, see, we told you, we can never trust the West. They never keep their promises. They won't comply with this deal. And then if we get to that stage and Iran feels that it isn't getting the benefit of the deal and that we have disengaged or reneged on our terms, then the deal will be dead in the water, and that's a genuine risk. So in terms of what we're doing, the UK government's approach to businesses and banks is based in that context. We're not urging them to rush back in. What we're trying to do is help businesses and banks understand what the new sanctions, what is being lifted and what's not. The other thing to make clear is at the moment we're saying nothing has been lifted yet. So again, sort of not urging to rush in, but there are opportunities. So we're working with those businesses and banks to help them understand both EU sanctions and actually also, again, the complex web of US sanctions that will remain. As I said, a lot of the banks are very concerned still that they wouldn't inadvertently trip US sanctions. We've just started doing that. I think throughout the course of this negotiation, the UK has been very keen to urge companies not to think that this is a free-for-all and be rushing back in. And again, for all the reasons that Liz set out in terms of sanctions are the only risk of doing business with Iran. So I think we're trying to work constructively with businesses to help them understand where the opportunities are so that Iran does feel the benefit, but also help them understand how to navigate these other risks.
Thank you. So I may actually turn to Sean for a moment first. So Sean, you spent many years as the top sanctions lawyer in the U.S. government. The U.S. government's position is slightly different from that of the British government and the European governments, again, because most U.S. businesses won't be able to re-engage. Nonetheless, the approach that the U.S. government takes to sanctions enforcement and to clarifying the scope of what is within the terms of the agreement and was not will be very, very important here and globally. So maybe talk a little bit about the tools that the U.S. government has on its own and in concert with some of its partners to communicate with the private sector, to draw clear lines about what's in and what's out.
Sure. Thank you very much, Zach. And if I may clarify,
Please.
I am speaking entirely in a personal capacity today and not on behalf of my current or previous employers.
Absolutely.
You know, my view on that, Zach, is OFAC and the State Department and broader parts of the U.S. government really could do a much better job of providing clarity to the U.S. public in terms of what's permitted and what's prohibited. And I think the biggest enemy of clarity is the conditions that are often attached to lifting sanctions. For example, when sanctions were relaxed with respect to Burma several years ago, they weren't really relaxed. I mean, they were relaxed, but new investment was allowed in Burma subject to a variety of conditions, reporting requirements, can't interact with anybody who's still on the OFAC list, and experience quickly proved a large number of influential businessmen and businesses remained on the OFAC list. It was hard to find a landlord in Burma who wasn't somehow connected to the OFAC list. And if you were successful, you had to file these reports that were made public with the State Department about your internal compliance programs and corporate social responsibility. Those were all worthy objectives, I think, but the cumulative effect of that was to create a lot of uncertainty, because in the enforcement environment that Liz and others have mentioned, you want to get it right. You don't want to make a mistake. I think OFAC does issue regulations, and they put FAQs on the website, but I don't think if the idea is to encourage more engagement, I don't think the public needs more information. I think they need fewer conditions and simpler indications of what's permitted and what isn't.
Interesting, thank you. So Caroline, the second question I wanted to ask, I think in some ways builds on both Sean and Colin's interventions, and that is about what happens if the deal in some respects starts to unravel because Iran doesn't get the benefit of its bargain, or because Congress votes some measure of disapproval. So there's a world in which, or there's a narrative at least, that if the U.S. doesn't perceive that the deal or the verification measures are going as intended, unilaterally, just as we imposed secondary sanctions in the last several years, that the U.S. government can reimpose sanctions that will force Iranian adherence, or that can reimpose sort of the situation that prevailed over the last several years. From the perspective of a close ally and a partner government, does the U.S. government have that ability? What are the limitations on the U.S. government's ability to, with unilateral sanctions, impose further pressure in the context of the current situation?
Sure. I think it's worth bearing in mind that whilst the US secondary sanctions were, I guess, a US unilateral move, they were still adhered to by the rest of the international community. It did take international unity to enforce this incredibly comprehensive sanctions regime. And at the same time as you were seeing US sanctions be put in place here in terms of secondary sanctions, we were actually working very closely with the US in the EU to impose European sanctions to build that overarching comprehensive sanctions regime. If the US, either at the behest of Congress, were to withdraw from the deal, I think maintaining that unity would be extremely difficult. And I think there are two problems. One is just it has cost European countries, others, it has cost them economically to adhere to these sanctions. But obviously everyone was willing to do so. I think our Chancellor of the Exchequer was at one point explicitly asked the question, is it worth it in terms of trying to curtail Iran's nuclear program? And the obvious answer is yes. So it would be incredibly difficult to persuade the rest of the P5+1 and the wider international community that have to adhere to these sanctions that it is still worth it if we've spent 2 years just in this negotiation process, but even longer in the broader negotiation process to get to this point. We have a deal where London, Moscow, Paris, Beijing, Berlin all believe that this is a deal that's in our national security interests, that we think is good enough. If the US were the country to cause that to fall apart, I think it would be very difficult to bring Iran back to the table. I think the idea that we could bring Iran back to the table and just say, okay, so that deal we negotiated, actually we want more, it's not a realistic prospect. And so I think the idea that the US could unilaterally impose new sanctions that the rest of the international community would then adhere to is very questionable, I think.
Interesting, thank you. A very important, I think, intervention over the next 2 months. We've got a couple of minutes before we open it up to the audience, and I wanted to direct the last question to Colin. We've all discussed U.S. businesses will be barred, for the most part, from doing reestablishing commercial ties to Iran over the next, for the foreseeable future. Assuming everything goes well in the next 2, 3, 5 years, do you anticipate, and by well I mean Iran adheres to the monitoring and verification procedures that are outlined in the deal. European companies re-engage with some measure of success in a wide range of commercial fields, oil trade, et cetera. Do you anticipate pressure from American companies to be able to re-enter the Iranian market to compete more effectively against some of their European or Asian counterparts?
I think, Zach, there'll be some of that, but I suspect that at least Congress will be focused over the course of the next 2, 3, 4 years on ensuring scrupulous compliance to the deal. And that the question then before Congress will be, at what point might Congress be willing to terminate the sanctions that it has imposed by law, as distinguished from those that are imposed by executive order or other administrative action. And I think the focus of Congress over the course, assuming that the deal is not disapproved and moves forward in the scenario you described, will be on ensuring compliance and making certain prudential judgments about what sanctions ought to be lifted permanently and at what point.
Great. Thank you very much. So I think we've got microphones floating around. If you've got questions, please raise your hand. I think we'll do our best to get you a microphone so you can be heard. Sure, in the blue in the front here.
Thank you. I'm Nicole Uehara from Sojas Corporation. I just wondered, under the case of a snapback on sanctions, would there be any sort of grandfathering clause for any of these non-U.S. companies that have gone in to do any business deals with Iran? Thank you.
One for me? I mean, I think it will depend, and others are more expert than me on sort of how these contracts are negotiated. I think what's worth remembering is that in the last 10 years, when EU sanctions have been applied, there has been willingness to take the hit. The companies that already have contracts, that are already doing business with Iran, they would have to work out what that meant for them. And that there was willingness on the part of the EU, at least, to take forward those sanctions, even though that ties actually already existed. So I don't think I have the exact answer to your question, but what I'd say is on past experience, I don't believe that if we're a couple of years in and there are existing contracts and existing ties, if we see Iran reneging on its part of the deal, that won't cause us to hesitate in moving towards pushing Iran back towards compliance, either through snapback of sanctions or other measures.
Yeah. Jump on there.